Okay, hello, and this is lesson 3 on comparison skills. So, today we are trying to answer this question. Okay, so we've now done 2 poems, so we can kind of really get into the section B stuff. And this is an important lesson. Hopefully you'll be coming back to this lesson as the unit continues, so you can kind of go over how to craft a response. So the question we're looking at today is, how do poets present the effects of war in War Photographer and one other poem from Power and Conflict? Obviously, we're going to be using remains today because these are the first 2 that we have done. And so we need to think about, right, how do I answer this? How do I write solidly for about 45 minutes about this one question? So we need to think about comparison points. All right. Our kind of focus, what's our focus for our comparison? And hopefully throughout your response, you'll be able to have a few different focuses. Okay, so we can start off with form. All right, so what kind of form is the poem? Is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? Is it in free verse? And this, like I say, they don't have to have the same thing for you to be comparing. So, for example, you might compare Ozymandias, a sonnet, to My Last Duchess, a dramatic monologue. And although they're different, you've still got this point of comparison. All right, so you'd be saying about, in Ozymandias, Shelley uses a sonnet to reflect kind of the love that Ozymandias had for himself, or something along those lines. And you could say something like, whereas Browning uses a dramatic monologue to kind of show the self-importance of the Duke, or something like that. So as long as you're sticking to these focuses, you'll be fine in terms of your comparison. So language, all right, this is the most common one, what you're used to. So picking out specific words, phrases, language features. So you could discuss how 2 poets have used maybe similes for a different effect, but again, as long as you're comparing the language, they don't have to be the same thing. Imagery. So again, you're looking at what images have the poets created, and what's the different effect of those different images that you're looking at. The rhythm and the rhyme. Okay, so you're looking at whether it's regular or irregular. So if it's consistent, like we saw in War Photographer, think about why it's consistent. Yeah, what's the effect? If something's got an erratic rhyme scheme or it's inconsistent, think about, could that be reflecting anything in terms of the meaning or the message in the poem? You can compare the themes or the tone. You could think about, right, is it formal? Is it informal? What's the effect of that? Okay, do they have similar themes that they explore, but explore those in different ways? All right, thinking about your structure. Stanza length, line length, your caesura, your enjambment. Pick out those things and say, right, well, this poet's done this to have this effect, and this poet's chosen to do it this way to have this effect, or something like that. So these are kind of all your devices, so to speak, but your focus of your comparison paragraph doesn't need to be a device in particular. It could be the meaning or the message of the poem. So we've looked at Remains and War Photographer, and kind of how they both appear to be criticizing someone, obviously in different ways, but there's that similar feeling of criticism. And then you could use your methods to back that up. So if you think about this, it's putting a nice mnemonic for you, flirts. And so you've got that. So, I mean, maybe pause here might be a good idea. Write these down and these are the things that you need to draw on when you're setting your exam. Okay, so all right, I'll look at both of the form. All right, I'll look at the rhythm of both poems. Okay, so these are real key terms that we need you to kind of get familiar with, just so when you're writing, you know exactly kind of what you're comparing. You're not just talking about one poem and then talking about the other poem and it's quite random. All right, you bring in both poems together through these points of focus. Okay. So yeah, pause the video there and kind of make some notes on that section. And again, when you're doing other bits of writing, maybe come back to those notes that you make at this point. Right then, so what we're going to do now, I mean, we would be using these in lessons and you still will be using them really, is looking at this grid. And this is going to help you plan for your poetry response. Now, in your exam, you're not going to have the time to kind of write down all these things, but the idea is, as we're kind of learning the poems and we're learning how to compare, we should be able to kind of use this grid to really plot out a tight comparison. Then, as we move on into year 11 and get closer to the exam, hopefully we can kind of take these grids away and you can start planning in this same way in your head. Okay, so we start off with a comparative focus. Now that brings you back down to here, these things. So you're going to put in this first column, all right, because you're going to be filling out this grid in a moment. And you're going to pick something from this first column. All right, so for example, right, let's focus on imagery. And we'll put imagery in here. All right, and then we'll talk about, right, in Wall Photographer, pick out a certain image that you found was quite striking, make a note about the effect, and then do the same for remains. Okay, so quite a striking image, maybe the guts being tossed back into the body, and again, talk about the effect. So essentially, across here, you're making a skeleton. You're making a skeleton of your paragraph. Okay, so here's one I made earlier. So I've got imagery, I've started with remains, so tossed his guts into his body and carted off in the back of a lorry, and I've just put effect, shows us the lack of respect for the looter is dehumanized. All right, obviously my paragraph's going to be a lot more detailed than that. All right, but for now, this is fine. Okay, so I've focused on imagery there. All right, so now in poem 2, I need to find some imagery in here. Okay, I've done that. Fields exploding beneath the feet of running children. And I've said the effect. The horrific imagery shows us the reality of what people face, just like a photograph would. Or it could show the innocence of children. And again, these are ideas that you're going to explore in your paragraphs. But I mean, for now, we're just planning what we're going to say. All right, so then the next one, I've obviously gone back down here. I've thought, right, I'm going to compare the meaning of both poems, or the message. All right, so I've gone in here. Poem 1, Remains. I've said it could be criticizing masculine culture with a quote, somebody else and somebody else. All right, the effect is it's showing us that they're all trained to be all the same. All right, so then I'm going to go back to the meaning. And again, I'm directly comparing. All right, these are completely different poems, but you're finding links in there. So not criticizing a culture, but criticizing the public. When Duffy writes about the eyes pricking with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. It shows that people ignore crises on purpose so they can go on with their normal lives. All right, so again, this is just a skeleton of a paragraph. Obviously, we would then tie that in. Okay, so your next job is to pause here, and I've sent you one of these grids out. Okay, so I mean, you can, if you're working on pen and paper, then feel free to draw out the grid, send me the picture of that, or just fill it right into the Word document if that's the way you're working. Okay, so you should hopefully end up with 5 different paragraphs ready to go. Okay, if you want to use these, try not to, and just fill in 5 different things. So go back through your notes that you made on Remains and War Photographer, and maybe look back at the other lessons that can give you some ideas, and have a go at filling in this grid so you've got a good body to work with when you're going into your writing bit. Okay, so pause now, fill in the grid. Okay, so if we go down to this bit then, all right, so this is basically a success criteria for you to use in these 2 boxes here. Okay, this is a success criteria for a paragraph. However, all right, you don't need to get every single bullet point in every paragraph. Okay, so for example, sometimes you're not going to be able to make a contextual link. Sometimes for what you're saying, you might only be able to think of one interpretation. So this is just a good guide to kind of making you get detailed paragraphs and what to think as you're writing. So I'll go through them then. So introduce a point relating to both poems. So at the start of each paragraph, just kind of introduce that comparison focus. All right, so use the word in the question, choose an area of focus. So is it imagery? Is it the message? Is it language or something like that? Then you'd go into exploring poem 1. Okay, and again, this is how you're used to writing. All right, make a detailed point, expanded on your area of focus. All right, regarding that poem. Include a quotation or a reference, make some inference, analyze that in further detail, and then again, if you can, include an alternative interpretation and a link to context. Then do exactly the same with poem 2, except you're going to link it back. So bring it back to that area of focus. So that examiner knows that you are doing a tight comparison. You are comparing one thing in one poem with the same thing in the other poem. Okay. And then another few things just to kind of make sure, when, again, with that comparison, try and make short, subtle references to the other poem. So as you're analyzing poem 1, can you just make a little kind of link back to the other poem as you're exploring it? And again, use tentative language. We spoke about this particularly in lesson 1, where there is no right answer. All right, we're not going to call these poets up and ask them what they meant. All right, it's poetry's art. It's up to us to kind of explore and interpret in our own ways. All right, so you're always kind of putting these words in: perhaps, possibly, maybe, might. Okay, so take note of those, and I'll go through it with you when we go through the example paragraphs, just to kind of show you why this makes up your success criteria. So this is the mark scheme that you're going to be well marked on. This is what the examiners are going to use. And now up here you've got at level 4. This is between 16 and 20 marks. So I mean, if you can do these bullet points, we're looking at grade 5 pushing grade 6. Okay, and that's this clear comparison and effective use of references to support your explanation. Okay, so we go back to here, clear comparison. So by doing this, all right, you're hitting that. By doing this, your sentence links. By making short sort of references to the other poem, then you are managing to do that clear comparison. All right, your other one for AO1 is your effective use of references. Okay, by doing this, all right, again here, you're getting that bullet point. So by doing what's on here, you're automatically picking up these marks. Okay, so for your AO2, clear explanation of the methods with use of subject terminology and understanding of the effects. So again, by doing this, analyzing in further detail, okay, then that's where you're picking up those marks. And hopefully by now, that subject terminology is kind of coming out naturally when you're writing. And clear understanding of ideas and perspectives, contextual factors, okay, is your links to context. So there's a reason why I'm trying to get you to include all of these bullet points. And now this was kind of high level 5, low level 6. If you go up into the next category, you'll see it asks you for a thoughtful, developed consideration. All right, so if you're going to be thoughtful, and if you're going to produce a developed response, then this is where these come really handy. Okay, by you saying, well, perhaps the writer could mean this, but on the other hand, we could interpret it this way. All right, then that's you being thoughtful, and that's definitely kind of going to get you up into that. Hopefully, depending on how detailed it is, into that higher band. Okay, so hopefully you've filled in your grid now. All right, and we know what makes up a good paragraph. So I'll just show you an example. All right, and again, these are a bit wordy. I mean, if it was written down, all right, this is going to take up a good page, maybe a little bit more of your exam thing, but I mean, that's not a bad thing. All right, I've included this. So students often ask, how many paragraphs do I need to write? Okay, there's no answer to that. So your paragraph should be differing in length. All right, so for one area of focus, you might have a little bit to say, whereas in another, you might have a lot to say. Okay, so fewer detailed paragraphs are better than having loads of paragraphs just kind of picking out language features and stuff like that. If there's no substance, if there's no analysis, then you're not going to get up into those higher bands. Okay, so use your 45 minutes. Just keep writing for that amount of time. Try not to get a target of paragraphs, say, oh, I need to get 4 paragraphs in. It doesn't matter. All right, if you've got 2 paragraphs that are really detailed and you've explored them really well, and you've used that 45 minutes, all right, then that's probably better than just trying to write loads about different things. Okay, so start off with then, so my introducer point bit is Duffy and Armitage both use horrifying imagery to show us the horrors of war. Okay, so this is my top row. I'm just turning this row into a detailed paragraph like you're going to do shortly. All right, so, and again, hopefully you'll be able to see where I'm following these, but obviously I might not be getting everything in there. So Armitage makes us see the way the enemy is treated in war when he writes that his guts were tossed back into his body and he was carted off in the back of a lorry. Okay, so that's me making a more detailed point, expanded on the area of focus. Okay, I've also got in my quotation. This allows us to see that Luther was completely dehumanized, which leaves us feeling appalled, much like in Duffy's poem. Now, that's again where I've got one of these kind of short, subtle references to the other poem. All right, the verb toss shows a complete disregard that this is a human being. We usually show respect to the dead, and carted could make us think that they are just treating the looter like an animal. All right, so that's this analysis in further detail, and I'm using that subject terminology there as well. Again, could make us think that they are just treating the looter like an animal. Okay, so it's just, you basically, when you're writing these, you're almost having a discussion with yourself. All right, you could you can question yourself. I mean, you don't need to be sure. You're just kind of playing with what the poet's giving you. Okay, right. Next part, Duffy also uses imagery to shock us and make us feel sorry for the victims of war. Okay, so again, I'm bringing it back to that initial area of focus. Okay, talked about the imagery here, and now I'm coming back to imagery, but perhaps to an even more extreme level than in Remains. Again, that's that comparison coming through. I'm always kind of coming back and flitting between the two poems. She draws reference to fields exploding beneath the feet of running children, which has the ability to make us feel sick. The phrase running children really highlights the horrific traumas of people that we could never imagine, and we see that these children are not running in jest, but away from danger. So that's my first bit of analysis. And now I'm going to include an alternative interpretation. So we could also interpret this phrase differently, as running children has connotations of innocence. These children are having their innocence torn apart, and we are forced to face the realities of what happens in other countries, just like what the war photographer appears to be trying to do. Okay, so again, I'm getting that alternative interpretation in there as well. Okay, and kind of talking about what we're feeling and how we're feeling and what the war photographer is trying to do. It's kind of making contextual links, not in the way that you're talking about the history of the poem or something like that, but kind of bringing the links into how kind of people feel, and you're talking about what's the message behind the poem, all right, about the war photographer and his aim. Okay, so I'll just show you one more. So up in here, I talked about the message or the meaning. Okay, so again, you can do it in a similar way. Okay, both Duffy and Armitage appear to be criticising people in their poems. However, Armitage seems to be aiming it at the culture of the army, whereas Duffy could be criticising public attitudes. So I'm just following this kind of structure of the paragraph again. Armitage does this by having the narrator describe his colleagues as somebody else and somebody else. We see this as strange, as we would expect him to remember who was there, but perhaps it is Armitage making the point that all of the soldiers appear to be trained in the same way, to shoot on sight, also emphasized by free of a kind or let him fly. So again, I'm getting this, perhaps I'm discussing, all right, I'm not getting a right answer, I'm just discussing. Duffy shows criticism in a different way. Okay, so again, you're bringing it right back to that first point of comparison and making a real clear comparison throughout yours. Particularly when writing that the eyes prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. She seems to be focusing on the fact that we understand that this is sadness, but because this is happening so far away, we don't have that emotional connection. There would be outrage if these things were happening close to home. Again, a little subtle contextual. You don't have to be kind of right. You don't need to kind of write anything to say, look at me, I'm including context, just little subtle things about kind of how we interpret it. Yet Duffy highlights the fact that we move on with our simple lives and choose to ignore the happenings around the world. Okay, so again, that's just how my grid has turned into paragraphs. And like I say, when you come to do yours, all right, you might get maybe 3 paragraphs done, and that's your 45 minutes up. All right, and that's fine. You don't need to get as many in as possible. You just start with one, explore it in as much detail as you can. When you've finished and you've had a look and think, can I explore that anymore? You go to your next one. Okay, and so you use your 45 minutes just kind of building on each bit, not trying to get every single point that you've planned for in there. Okay, so I mean, you might need to have a look back at the video, rewind it a little bit and kind of see the points that I've made, but I think you're now ready to give an answer. So the question: how do poets present the effects of war in War Photographer and one other poem from Power and Conflict? All right, time yourself 45 minutes, and send me the end product, and hopefully we'll start to see some real good comparison. Also, if you can, just kind of point out, almost like do a little self-assessment at the end, and just say, so for example, right, okay, show me where you've included a quotation, show me where you've included an alternative interpretation, okay, and just kind of pick out, so you know and I know that you're including the right things in there. Okay, so get those responses back to me as soon as possible. The quicker they come back to me, the quicker I can get your feedback out for you. Okay, enjoy.